Hello, I'm Al Fry, and in the following presentation, we're going to explore further into some history that you've probably never heard. And if you're a seeker of the truth, remember, this series will examine and clarify many of the mysteries of our planet on a wide range of subjects. A confirmation of many of the concepts presented here will be found in many lesser-known books and manuscripts. Mankind has always feared the things that were beyond its understanding. Accepted history shows only crude facts, and fully demonstrable and explainable through archaeological findings. The destroyed walls of a city, for example, can corroborate the reality of some ancient battle, or a marble statue of an old ruler proves the fact that he actually existed at some time. Yet it seems that everything that bears the slightest touch of mystery is immediately classified as legend, a product of human imagination. And there's even a modern trend to ascribe these legends to some psychological problems, which are supposed to be solved this way by primitive human minds. It's interesting to notice that nobody has still tried to discover what type of psychic disturbance is being solved in our time by denying the possibility of the so-called legends being actual descriptions of facts that happened, but they're not fully understood by the humans who observed them, and still less by modern historians. And for example, there are many things in the Old Testament that are classified as religious or mystical experiences which must, at best, be considered metaphysical or metaphorical, or as having some obscure symbolism. Greek mythology is interpreted as the invention of supernatural figures, endowed with powers ordinary humans always wish to possess, thus becoming sublimations, archetypes, wish fulfillments, and so on and so forth. It seems that nobody today in his sound reason would even entertain even the slightest idea that there might be something or somebody on the top of Olympus besides frequent clouds and mists. The Middle Ages are also full of things our modern history would be happy to make everybody forget, being unable to do so completely, just because they're closely linked to many understandable and undeniable historical facts, and they keep appearing in the writings of important philosophers who cannot all be erased from the textbooks. The alchemists, to whom our modern chemistry owes so many of its first breakthroughs, are classified as charlatans when they state that they found the philosopher's stone and succeeded in making gold from lead. And still, our modern, objective, and mystery-destroying history fails to explain several interesting facts, leaving them in the realm of questions that cultured people should not be asking just because other cultured people are unable to answer them. For example, where did all the goldware found in India, China, and other countries of the Orient come from? India and China are not among gold-producing countries. Nobody has ever found the mines where all the gold of the Maharajas and Mandarins came from. And the same could be said about the Indians before the discovery of America. Aztec, Incas, and other cultures used gold for almost everything, but nobody ever tells anything about the methods of gold mining employed by them. When the Spanish conquerors arrived, the places where there was actually gold in America was still untouched and contained all the gold Europe might wish to mine, while these mines should have been exhausted if all the gold used by the Indians had been taken out of them. Probably one of the most interesting cases of unexplained historical facts can be found in the Old Testament, with King Solomon as the protagonist. Israel could not be considered as a rich country when Solomon became its ruler. David had left it as a state of shepherds who owned very little, if anything, outside their herds, And then all of a sudden this little country became the most magnificent, rich, and powerful kingdom that's ever been known on Earth, according to the records. Gold in an immense quantity was used to cover the famous temple and the palaces. The most powerful kings considered a great honor to be able to visit Solomon and see his face and listen to his wisdom, all being surprised when they saw his wealth, which was far greater than anything that they were able to imagine. The Old Testament states that silver was not considered as precious under Solomon's rule, and that he practically paved Jerusalem with silver like cobblestones. Well, how did all this wealth appear so suddenly? Where did all this gold come from? Legend says that Solomon had mines in Central Africa, but with the means of transportation used in those times, his lifetime would not be enough to bring so much gold from so far. Well, King Solomon himself was a mysterious figure in history. Legends repeated over in a low voice during the Middle Ages mentions powerful things about him, wonderful things, but they must not be spoken out loud, or the Holy Inquisitor might hear them. His ring was supposed to have a great power. Well, making its bearer more powerful than all the kings on earth put together. It was even whispered and assumed in some old manuscripts that he had some treaty with demons who worshipped and obeyed him. Despite all this power and glory, his tomb has never been found by archaeologists. And here the Old Testament makes a strange reference, which could indicate that somebody has torn some pages out of history somewhere. In one place it's mentioned that whatever Solomon did is carefully described in the book Solomon's Deeds. And where are all these books? Well, the best we can get from our historians is a shrug. Nobody's ever read them and been able to recount that he found in their pages. And did they tell us things the human mind was not prepared to understand and therefore referred to destroy? And who destroyed them? Or would some holiness suffer if these books were included in the Bibles? Well, we'll never know. Just quite who and by what right they decided to proclaim themselves judge of the one who was the greatest of all men, denying the future generations the right to know the truth about the past of mankind. Well, one thing remains clearly visible. Our knowledge about our planet is not complete. Pages and even whole volumes have been torn out of history. But is it possible to erase whole chapters of events so as not to leave the slightest hint of what actually happened? Well, mankind is composed of many different cultures, and if one has destroyed an unwanted evidence somewhere, in some other place, a different culture may have reconstructed or recorded in writing or in memory some of the more outstanding facts regarding those times and events. Well, somewhere there has to be some book mentioning what has been kept from our eyes, and such a book does exist. And it comes from the mysterious Orient, where people are not afraid to talk about things that they've witnessed, but fail to understand, limiting themselves to describe what they saw in terms in which their own minds allowed them to interpret the evidence. Well, the title of the book, of course, that we're talking about is The 1001 Nights. This book has always been considered in the Western countries as simple fairy tales, not worth really thinking about seriously. And yet what the West has seen has usually been abbreviated translations, where much of the original text has been excluded, and sometimes something very quite different when one reads a full and unabridged version of this unusual book. References have been made that the full version is rather unprintable according to Western standards, and this is true in a way. The book cannot be considered as immoral It just belongs to a different culture. It was written by a people who are not ashamed of their bodies with all their organs and functions. Of course, this can be a little shocking for a member of society where the human body is considered as something indecent, unless it's covered with clothes, which of course very often make it only still more indecent. But when the translations are made, many detailed descriptions of great interest are lost at the same time as some too spicy expressions also. And there are stories that would be a little hard for Christians to read, that whoever wants to really can penetrate into the marvelous world of the 1001 Nights. And if you want to read the true, unabridged history of that period, then get the full version of it. And just what kinds of stories does this book contain? How old are they? Well, the author of this book, Scheherazade, is first mentioned in the Indian book Katha Sarit Sagara, dating from the 10th century of the Christian era. So it's logical to accept that it was written approximately at that time. Most of the stories belong to the Islamic era, but they can be adaptations from older ones. There's at least one story which is masterfully pre-Islamic. Also, there are stories, though very few, that have been added later, dealing with Tamerlane, who lived during the years 1336 to 1405 A.D., and other obviously invented things, opium dreams and such. But the immense majority of the stories are truthful narrations of historical events, be they wars, things that happened to known persons from the Islamic history, or just descriptions made by travelers of their adventures. There are also special tales to illustrate the Islamic doctrine and philosophy, as well as just plain anecdotes and the hashish dreams, which can easily be differentiated from the former ones. The book itself is of Indian origin, yet belongs to the Muslims established in India. With the only exceptions of obviously invented stories, the descriptions are very accurate, even though the narrator did not always understand what he'd seen, limiting self to express in terms of understandable for him what was beyond his usual everyday experience. So, for instance, there were descriptions of things which Arabs, or at least the Arabs from cities, did not know, but which result in quite familiar source for modern reader, particularly with the one who's visited different countries. And if some descriptions of what is presented as something unusual are true, then there's no reason for believing that other things in the same story have to be simple inventions. Historians that go back to this period observe that authors of these stories had actual very little imagination, if any at all. They just narrated things as they happened, without embellishing them or adding anything out of their own fantasy. It's a feature of the Eastern, and particularly Muslim, character to relate with great precision the facts they witnessed or stories they've been told, without introducing the slightest change in them. So now we're ready to open this mysterious book, a door into the past of mankind, and a door that leads us into a wonderful and unusual world. And first we must get acquainted with the people whose stories are told there, their mental setup and cultural attitudes. And it's a world of brilliant knights who never experience any fear when in danger, but may easily faint before a beautiful girl. A world of enchanting girls with innocent looks who can seduce the best man and play a dirty or even cruel joke on him. And a world of great rulers who can order their best friend's head to be chopped away just because of some word that they didn't like, or to forgive the life of a sentenced person who tells them a good story. A world of wild adventure and of people who are willing to risk their lives just in order to contemplate beauty, and in the face of deadly danger, praise God for making flowers so beautiful. And knowing that no matter in what a desperate situation they may be in, the Almighty will save them, and that the only these things happen that to have to happen, nothing else being possible. And this strange world, which belongs to the pages that have been torn from our history, is full of ever-present genies or jinn who appear at the least expected moments in order to help people, with some exceptions of those who came to harm. But they are rare and explainable, and as things happen over this ancient world, as a great protecting shadow, these jinn protect those who need protection, and it's the invisible but constantly present ideas, concepts that are in people's hearts and minds that aid them and image the wisdom of Solomon ben David in peace and prayer with both. Now, if only one or two stories are read, they may seem fantastic enough to consider them as products of imagination. But when you continue reading, the descriptions of the jinn begin to follow a certain pattern. More hints at their origin can be found in each new story that you run across. And the reader will begin to recognize strangely familiar things. That is, familiar to our present civilization, but completely unknown in the described times of that era. At least after reading over half the book, one begins to see a sort of connection between the descriptions found in different stories, falling together as parts of a puzzle to a present and a whole picture. One begins to recognize strangely familiar things. Things that you catch over and over throughout the books. And after finishing this great books, all things have occupied their precise places in the great whole context, showing us very clearly that part of our past, which has been denied us by history, by filling the gaps, interplacing with the so-called legends of other civilizations, and offering a complete new idea of a long period in this past of mankind of ours being able to project some light on things that are happening in our present time. And one thing should stand out quite clearly from the beginning. Jinn are not ghosts or spiritual beings, as modern interpretations of Oriental mythology would like to make us believe. The people in the stories are physically similar to us, but on a different level of cultural and technological development. And also it's obvious that the narrators sometimes mistook machines for living beings. Many strange beasts and such are described. Now, a machine controlled by an intelligent being appears to be acting in an intelligent way, and for an observer who has never been seeing any machines before, that would be far more complicated than the simplest application of levers, such as a machine. It would appear as a living creature, and it would appear to be an intelligent one. Later, we'll try to point out and explain in detail who the jinn were and the achievements of their technology and knowledge, as well as indicate the exactitude of the descriptions in the 1001 Nights, where things are related that can be known only to people who have experienced them. and which would be impossible to imagine correctly for somebody belonging to a non-technological culture, as that of the ancient Arabs. At this point, though, we want to return to the missing pages in our history to fill in these gaps, to offer replies for the unanswerable questions, and finally allow the reader to see the complete aspect of the whole jigsaw puzzle, mankind's past here for the viewer. And our story begins far away in time and space, probably on some faraway planets, if you read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, because it's not difficult to find such contradictions between the first and second chapters. Now, it's very probable that many pages have disappeared from between these chapters. And it's not our purpose here to discuss the Old Testament, establishing who is who or whatever. We're referring here to things that show that in the 1001 Nights there are corroborations with other writing. Now, reading the Genesis as it is written, it's obvious that the people created by God in the beginning were not Adam and Eve. Well, once this God or Jinn saw that Adam really lived, he was filled with joy and pride, of course, and afterwards he called all of his friends to show them his achievement. He requested that they admire Adam and bow before him. According to the tradition, everyone did except one, Yahweh's best friend, a proud and wise man called Iblis, a great warrior and commander of a powerful army, and also a man filled with love for fine art, music, and singing. And he refused to bow before Adam. Still later, after many years, in the times of the 1001 Nights, Arabs used the expression, "May God confound Iblis." And here you see a couple of deity figures from these early cultures in the Mideast. It's interesting also that I found no evidence could identify Iblis with a Christian's concept of Satan, who is a mysterious being if one tries to search for him in the Bible, and needs some words of rehabilitation. But this I might do on some other occasion. And in the contrary, Iblis is differentiated from Shaitan, who is the Islamic version of Satan. So they are obviously different persons. And since this time, of course, 2 different races, though similar in appearance, inhabit our planet. The Old Testament makes this distinction by calling them children of God, indicating that they are those who are literally, directly created by God, and the children of men. Now, this can be checked in Genesis. Sons of God are mentioned to interbreed with the daughters of men. And they gave heroes as offspring. This fact also appears in Greek mythology, the heroes being the children of Olympic gods and Terran women. The Arabs simply called these hybrid races the Jinn, who obviously inhabit an infinity of planets in the universe, and the Adamites, or Ibn, or Adam, inhabit the earth. As an example of this, an Arab prince says to a Jinn princess, "How can it be that you, a princess of the Jinn, have fallen in love with me, an Adamite, an inferior being?" The Jinn boasts, "No Adamite has ever placed a foot on this ground." And another Jinn explains to an Earthman, "I must warn you that it is impossible for a son of Adam to know by looking at her face whether a daughter of Eve is really a virgin, since this knowledge belongs only to God and His chosen ones." And we can't venture too many thoughts as to when exactly the Jinn landed. The Egyptian records and scriptures tell about strange sights in the sky as far back as the reign of Thutmose III, and this is in the records. The story is inscribed on the walls and pillars of one of the temples, Ramses II. It's quite possible and likely that some kind of surveillance has always been kept over Earth in the descendants of Adam, just in case. And this has been mainly performed in such a way as not to interfere directly with the development of our planet, or the choice, though some chosen ones were aided by Jacob. The part that really interests us begins probably shortly before Solomon, David's son, became king of Israel. By the time this happened, several highly technological groups of jinn were firmly established on Earth. And these jinn could be classified basically into two main groups: those who were idolaters and those who worshiped the single God, who were called Muslim jinn, good Muslim jinn. Now, it seems somewhat surprising to find that Arabs call Muslim people who lived obviously long before Islamic era, including Kings David and Solomon, as well as many prophets of the Old Testament, and even the jinn. Yet this mystery is even easily solved. Yet in one of the stories, an Arab is asked to explain the basis of this marvelous faith, Islam, requiring that the Islam is based on the great truth revealed to Arabs by the prophet, and that there is no other God except God. So if you think about it, according to this definition, it's evident that whoever understood this great truth, independently from the time when this happened, can be considered a Muslim. From now on, we'll use this term as we describe Muslims, believer in the one God. He's differentiated from the gods and lords of the planets and those who follow them under dominion and domination. And somehow King Solomon managed to sign a treaty with the Muslim part of the jinn, validating it with his seal. And even about 20 centuries later, when people met a jinn, they asked him whether he recognized the validity of Solomon's seal. And if the jinn answered affirmatively, he was considered a friend who could be trusted. Now, if he did not recognize the seal of Solomon in the free choice system, they were politely asked to continue on their way without interfering with people. And to describe an evil jinn, it was stated that he was a jinn of bad species, one of the rebels who believed in nothing and didn't recognize the supremacy of Solomon bin Dod. And in the 1001 Nights, Solomon is referred to as master of all jinn, a thing that is also present in the medieval sayings of the West. And according to tradition, Solomon allied his forces with demons and acquired magic powers from them. Of course, a highly technological civilization is that of the jinn, using firearms and aircraft of different types and matter transmutation and anti-gravity, and having a scientific knowledge of chemistry and matter structure as we cannot even begin to imagine with our present state of development, could transform a poor shepherd kingdom in the most brilliant kingdom on earth in a very short time. Think about it. Gold and wealth, of course, would have been no problem under such a system. The most outstanding and historically important event that happened under Solomon's rule, any reference to which have mysteriously disappeared from the Old Testament, was the war. A war in which he, together with his friend Domriat, ruler of the Muslim jinn, destroyed the might of the Sea King, who was an idolater, refusing to recognize that there was only one God and to accept Solomon as the prophet of God. And this war took place somewhere between the years 973 and 933 BC, while Solomon was king of Israel. The defeated enemies escaped as they could, and many were pursued by the victorious army and destroyed during months after the end of the actual war. But some of them managed to hide where they could not be found, surviving and having a descendant. The descendants were considered as dangerous to the good Muslims. Well, unfortunately for our civilization, the kings who ruled Israel after Solomon were not considered by jinn as trustworthy, and all the wealth of the great kingdom on our planet disappeared very shortly after his death. Well, the case of Icarus was probably an unfortunate result of some Adamite having seen the flying device used by the inhabitants of Olympus and wishing to make such a thing himself. Pan helped the Greeks to win a battle just by making strange noises, causing panic, fear among their enemies. This can be explained assuming that Pan had some weapon that produced at the same time as audible sounds some fear-provoking subsonic waves. And these are only a few examples. And there were also forbidden places where jinn lived freely, no Adamite could ever approach. These were usually regions and places different from Earthmen, different, very inaccessible. Such places can be considered as sort of vacation sites for jinn, where some of them lived as they liked. And many of these forbidden places had the means to reach the planets of the jinn by means completely unknown even to our present science and civilization, either by space warping or through matter transmutation. They reach different dimensions or planets by these means, evidently. And as early as during the Umayyad dynasty, between the years 661 and 750 AD, one of the Umayyad rulers ordered an expedition to the forbidden city of Arian, the former domain of the Sea King, the one who did not want to recognize Solomon's supremacy. And on their way, they found many strange things and places that were the remnants of the great kingdoms, the very memory of which had been wiped out long ago. So how many of these places are still there, buried under the sands of the African deserts, just as the legends tell us? And after the Umayyad dynasty, there came the Abbasid dynasty with the famous Harun al-Rashid, who died in the year 193 of the Hijra, or 815 AD, and many extraordinary events took place during his kingdom. And generally speaking, his and kingdoms before his acquired a great deal of scientific knowledge from these jinn. Besides the technology apparent in their direct intervention, particularly in astronomy, there were many other areas. Many researchers, for example, are dumbfounded when they run across ancient astrolabes and calculation machines such as this one. Ancient, very workable. Here's another computation device from that era. It's an astrological computer. So where did the jinn get the knowledge? Which jinn did humanity get the knowledge from? The good jinn or the bad jinn? The Dominion forces? It's a good question to ask at this point. Seems about the same time in Europe there were also jinn visiting, a few brave ones who wanted to learn more than was allowed there. This wasn't easy in the Christian world, particularly in such times as the Middle Ages. There are only two groups of alien beings that were recognized, either the saints, the angels, or the devils. And we all know what happened to those who were considered the devils, their disciples. Those with higher abilities who did nothing unexplainable could pass for angels, but those who taught people different sciences, disturbing this way their mental peace, showing them things no human should know according to the ecclesiastical authorities, were of course devils, particularly if they had horns or happened to leave some odor of brimstone around, like the early alchemists. And those who could manage it sometimes made long and dangerous voyages to the Orient to learn the great sciences that were said to be known there. It could have been whispered in secret meetings that some particularly advanced alchemists managed to transform lead into gold. And we might add in this regard that Russia learned to make gold from lead back in the 60s. A special process. It was just too expensive to make it less than they could mine it. Technology can do it today. Why not back then? Well, it was whispered in secret meetings. It probably was true. The strange odors usually present in the alchemist laboratories confirmed the suspicions of the church that their science came from the devil. And in the meantime, the powerful dynasty of the Tulanides began to rule Egypt between the years 868 and 905 AD under the rule of Tulan, or rather Thylun, as he was known among the Arabs. And two brave men undertook a journey to the forbidden city of Shidad Benad, a ram of the pillars, looking for the most precious thing that existed among the people of the jinn. Well, after their return with obvious success, one of them died and the other one was thrown into the darkest dungeon by the cruel and ruthless Thylun because of refusing to tell him the secret of what he had brought and how to use what he had brought back. Well, then, somewhat after 1877 AD, the kind and merciful Mohammed bin Thylun, Thylun's son, heard casually about this event and freed the man from the dungeon. In sign of his gratitude, he revealed the secret to bin Thylun, or Ibn Tulan, as he was called now. And as a result, the famous Ibn Tulan, or Ben Tulan Mosque, was built in Cairo. Probably not less expensive than the famous Solomon's Temple, and paid in the same way as Solomon would have paid his expenses. We may add that the Ibn Tulan Mosque is still considered as one of the greatest masterpieces of old Cairo, and it's much admired by modern tourists, none of which even suspect its true history. It was probably made from alchemically made gold. Where else would the money have come from? Millions. So now this brings us up to the times of the 1001 Nights, the century 10 AD, the time of Scheherazade, the most cultured woman of her time, and possibly any time. A little is said about the time she was telling these stories, but among the few facts that refer to the period, there's an account of how King Shirar and his brother Shazazam met a jinn. So quite obviously, jinn were still present. And is there some likeliness of a line of uniformity interlacing the histories of all ages in a consequent and logical way? And are there any difference between today's UFOs and the giant birds and magic carpets of yesterday? Or are they just called something different in ancient times? And what are they here for? To teach us what our science is still unable to find out, even to dream about? And why do they come? And why don't they contact us? Are they afraid of being burned at the stake? Well, today we have different weapons. Are they coming to warn us about the dangers of playing around with things beyond our control? Or perhaps to monitor us for our carelessness? And as an Arab of the times of Harun al-Rashid would say, only God is the wisest and can differentiate between what is real and what is not real. Read the 1001 Nights if you're interested in some interesting history. Things like this. A girl here opening the wall clove asunder, and the damsel appeared, clad as before and holding the rod. Right out of the 1001 Nights. And in the meantime, it would be useful for modern mankind to become more familiarized with many of the old stories about Jen. Might learn that visitors from elsewhere are not to be feared necessarily because they're different. They're often friendly when not received in a hostile way. They could be of great help to those whom they consider as friends. And so ends Ladanki's observation on the 1001 Nights. And at this point, let's examine some related ideas that you'll probably never get from any history books you pick up. In the distant and dim past of the Mideast, there were some of the most advanced and stable governing systems in all of history. There were several dynasties that lasted longer than the British Empire and the U.S. of America to date. And the Sumerians and Semites of Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Babylonia, they all borrowed the best of their laws and cultures from earlier cultures. These had been destroyed in the cataclysmic earth upheavals. And the famed Atlantis, of course, was the primary example of this. The earlier gods of Sumeria eventually lost their immortality, as did those of later Egypt. The researchers of our time consider the numerous writings and records on this immortality issue as another groundless myth. Well, such truths are seldom recognized by materialistic skeptics. Persons who tap the so-called Akashic records tell us that the ancient records are usually correct. And a number of the early gods did rejuvenate themselves periodically. And according to these very unorthodox views, a representative of the Creator eventually came and took the powers of these early gods and moguls away because they misused their power. And this tale is covered to some extent in another incredible inquiry series called The Earth Report. And here we see some of the retinue of the servants that were butchered and sent in the tombs with the dead kings to attend them in the next world, which was a later unfortunate event. Came up after the kings lost their power of rejuvenation. A barbarous practice, custom. And kingdoms like rivaled Egypt's earlier kingdoms. And the gods had complete control. Here we see a lady in the court of the great days of And Christians may find it interesting that this messenger we spoke of, or representative of the Creator, was called the Windy One, which is translated Holy Ghost. Leaders on the planet at that time called him thus. Solomon was one of his descendants. It's best that we leave this subject to another presentation, however, and go on into the Mideast. Because the Arab language, for instance, has changed little in the last several thousand years due to the high esteem Muslims have for the original language of the Quran. The northern dialects are similar to the Aramaic, which was widely used in the Middle East at the time of Christ. Arabic poetry has always been found and famed, but it simply cannot be translated to retain much of the flavor and beauty that's in the original tongue. Well, 1001 Nights is full of the works of two outstanding poets who wrote during the Abbasid age of some 750 years A.D. Civilization since then crumbled. These works have remained, and they're still beautiful in their original tongue. And the culture in the Mideast, these areas, was filled with advanced works on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics and alchemy. And back then, Europe borrowed heavily from this knowledge to overcome her own medieval ignorance. And here's a Cairo University, which has changed little over the years. Later, of course, the Mongol invasions and Turks dried up the literary flow from the Mideast, and it never really recovered again. The advanced Arabian cultures came from the survivors of Atlantis during this occupation of Lower Egypt. Euclid's geometry books, for example, were originally Aramaic. Many of the great Muslim palaces are mathematical works of art. And Christians are seldom aware that Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness in Genesis. And the Prophet Muhammad instructions on visiting Mecca are closely tied in with these biblical events. And the pillars of faith of a Muslim center around prayer and being charitable and fasting occasionally and hopefully visiting Mecca as a pilgrim. Here we see some of the visitors near Mecca, thousands yearly. And here we see pilgrims on the Mount of Mercy. And it was here that their traditions tell that Adam rejoined Eve after the fall. Many of these rituals and traditions are tied right into Christianity. Well, due to the periodic floods or cataclysms that occur, the surface area and temperate zones of the Earth have changed many times. And in the Mideast area, the deserts of today were once the fertile areas of great advanced settlements, according to the traditions. And H.P. Lovecraft had access to ancient records or knowledge and filled his strange tales with mention of many of the larger antediluvian cities. Erem, the city of 1,000 pillars, was typical, and it was long buried beneath the Gobi Desert, along with the legendary Shambhala. And according to Oriental legends, there were a number of impressive cities that correspond to those mentioned in the Arabian Nights. And some feel these were colonies of Mu, or Atlantean empires of ancient times. And in Jeddah, a Mecca seaport, there's still a little-known museum there that contains hundreds of artifacts from these pre-Islamic periods. Researchers, Muslims of that area, and all outsiders are forbidden access to these ancient artifacts. The same secrecy exists, usually with private collections of records and writings scattered much over the East and Asia, private families, little-known monasteries and temples. They don't want outsiders meddling. And the so-called Holy Grail was a very ancient manuscript that could supposedly reveal the secrets of the gods and the ancients and bring the bearer power. Many felt it was still held in some private collection in the Mideast. Well, according to the most ancient tablets and later Egyptian papyruses, the Homo sapiens species is unique among all other animal forms. Well, we humans not only have a soul and a body like animals, we have a very special force that allows us to evolve towards godhood. Our human minds feed good and unethical or evil thoughts both to our brain. And instead of acting on instinct, we must act in choice. It's conscience that's the mouthpiece of the soul. No matter how long it takes, the materialistic lusts must give way to more spiritual and ethical soul-balanced actions. Alfred B. Glazier, who wrote his Modern Human Comprehension text in the mid-70s, said the same thing and detailed exactly how the special minds came into being and could be balanced to perform so-called miracles like some of the spiritual leaders could perform. Glazier, like many others before him, claimed to recall former lives on the planet thousands of years ago and told of many of the ancient records, why they existed. He said that many persons who had not balanced their various components by the turn of this century would eventually lose some of these components and go back and return to an animal instinct level, going back to the pre-Adamic state, so to speak. James Churchward was a very unique writer that had other things to say about the ancient world, and he was from the 20s. He did his whole series of books on the ancient motherland of mankind. And his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, and other titles were very popular and have been read probably more than any other works in this area of interest. Churchward spent time in India and chanced upon what he called the Nuku tablets there. And these were symbolic records which were written in the ancient motherland. They eventually wound up in India. And here we see some examples, the hieroglyphics, the symbols. The second group of tablets, later discovered in Mexico, also were written in the ancient alphabet of Mu. And some of the tablets gave an account of creation, another detailed history of the earliest man. They told of an ancient and very advanced culture on a continent somewhere north of the Hawaiian Islands, Lemuria or Atlantis. And according to the records, some 12,000 years ago or so, this civilization submerged and the remnants found their way to other areas where they had a hand in making the ancient civilizations like Chaldea and Babylonia, and Egypt, the great civilizations that they were in the beginning of our history. The language of the motherland was Naga Maya, and virtually all of the major world languages are filled with these Maya words. About half of the Japanese language is Kara Maya. India has Maya in it, and Mexican Indians can speak quite well with Japanese because their languages are so similar. Egyptian, Chaldean, and dozens of later languages were riddled with words and symbols from the motherland. Most words which had a C sound like a K were originally from the original language. Well, family names, names of simple actions and instruments are often similar in languages spread all over the planet. Showing, of course, there had to be an original source language. Well, in Latin America, the Maya spoke for the past hundreds of years has been corrupted by Aztec and Nahuatl, yet the words for ma have survived as mother in most languages. According to the ancient tablets, the world was created in 7 periods of time, and our species was given an imperishable spirit after the fashion of our Creator. Later versions in various later cultures distorted many of these original concepts. The Hebrew historical records like the Bible are examples of this. Many of the early books of the Old Testament were actually written by Moses from Egyptian temple records in many cases. And they were originally in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And when these were translated, the experts of the time made the same mistake as they do today. They often translate literal meanings from symbols which only represented something. Well, Churchward and many open-minded researchers found that most of the serious creation records of all later cultures were filled with errors and nonsense. And 800 years after Moses died, Ezra and others literally butchered the original concepts of the great leaders and gods in the motherland. Well, while Churchward's book sold to the public for many years, his concepts were never really accepted by the state-funded experts. They often ignored his brilliant translation keys from these ancient motherland documents. And only private organizations like the Rosicrucian Order in San Jose, California, ever took the time to check out his research and confirm it by their own comparisons. Well, surprisingly enough, according to the translations, the motherland, the original founders of the great cultures and cities of Latin America, were white-skinned, blue-eyed gods with beards. They brought great technology and knowledge to the original Indians of the area, Latin America. It's interesting that a few delicate art objects, like cocks of inlaid gold and precious stones, are also found in the Zebwati ruins in Africa, perhaps like the cock found in the Great Pyramid by the Caliph, which of course leads us off into the Arabian Nights fantasy again. Well, the Mayas considered themselves descendants of the gods of the East. And these divine leaders came from an area, and their land sank in the sea, according to the records. And they built these huge cities with water and waste systems, just as they are today. And they flourished until their leaders left, and later Spanish barbarians came for what was left of their civilizations, the remnants of their past glorious cities and monolithic systems, interconnected cities all over Latin America. And there are thousands of vignettes and rock drawings that are found all over the West with ancient symbols of the motherland. Some even depict burnt sacrifices to the memory of the fiery death of the motherland. The Essene sect did send out a great many teachers throughout their history. And if you're interested further in this unique story, this great teacher, further data can be found in the secret teachings of Jesus and the book He Walked the Americas, and Mormon records in Salt Lake City. Benjamin Franklin and various others have mentioned the use of the Indians' Constitution in making up our own in this country, and it's very ironic that so few persons know about our own national spiritual figure in their spiritual questing.